Blood smells like rusted pennies mixed with sour adrenaline. $500,000 sits in crisp stacks, waiting for any poor bastard who can survive 5 seconds. Bones snap, men scream. Victor smiles, flicking crimson from his knuckles. Then, footsteps echo. Someone small walks forward, grinning. Oliver pressed the back of his skull against a damp concrete pillar, feeling the deep rhythmic vibrations of the subway rumbling somewhere beneath them. He closed his eyes, inhaling the thick air of the subterranean warehouse. It smelled of spilled diesel fuel, cheap cigar smoke, and the sharp, unmistakable ammonia of human fear. Oliver was 61 years old, a cut man who had spent 40 of those years watching men destroy each other for crumpled bills in basements just like this one. He had seen every flavor of violence. He thought he had grown numb to it. Then came Victor. Oliver opened his eyes and watched the center of the room, a makeshift ring defined only by a square of thick white chalk drawn onto the cracked cement floor. Inside that square stood Victor, a 7'2" mountain of pale, dense muscle born in a Soviet training camp and refined in the brutal, shadow-cloaked depths of the KGB. He didn't look like a typical heavy-hitting brawler. There was no swagger, no bouncing on the balls of his feet, no performative rolling of the shoulders. Victor stood completely still, his breathing shallow and even. His skin possessed a sickly translucent quality under the buzzing halogen lights, stretched tight over bones that looked too large for a human frame. Oliver hated looking at him. It made his own joints ache. It reminded him of standing at the edge of a frozen ocean, vast, indifferent, and lethal. A body hit the concrete with a wet, heavy thud. It was a local heavyweight named Thomas, a man who weighed 260 pounds and benched old engine blocks for fun. Thomas was currently convulsing, his eyes rolled back so far only the yellowed whites showed. A dark pool of blood was already spreading from his nose, mapping the uneven topography of the floor. Oliver hadn't even tracked the punch that put him there. 1 second, Thomas was stepping in, throwing a wild, desperate overhand right. The next, a sound like a wet towel snapping against a brick wall echoed through the room, and Thomas was folding inward, a puppet with its strings abruptly severed. Victor looked down at the unconscious man. He didn't flex. He didn't roar for the crowd. He merely reached up with a hand the size of a dinner plate and calmly adjusted the tape wrapped around his knuckles. He wasn't even sweating. The crowd, a miserable collection of degenerate gamblers, loan sharks, and junkies gripping their betting slips, was dead silent. There was no cheering. You don't cheer for a natural disaster. You just watch it level the town and pray it doesn't turn toward your house. "Get him out of here," a voice barked. Cole, the man running the slaughterhouse, stepped into the light. Cole was a jittery man in a cheap polyester suit that smelled perpetually of dry cleaning chemicals and nervous sweat. 2 men scurried into the chalk square, grabbed Thomas by his boots, and dragged him away, leaving a smear of red across the gray floor. Oliver swallowed the bitter taste of stale coffee that had backed up into his throat. He hated this. He hated the mechanics of it. Violence, in its purest form, is just physics. Mass times acceleration. When you are 7 feet and 2 inches tall, when your bones are as thick as lead pipes, you don't need to be fast. You just need to connect. But the terrifying contradiction about Victor was that he was fast. He moved with a horrifying liquid efficiency. Every strike was calculated, stripped of emotion. He fought like a man stamping paperwork. "Who's next?" Cole yelled, his voice cracking slightly as it bounced off the low ceiling. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the shadowed faces of the crowd. Men suddenly found their shoes very interesting. Some coughed. Others took long, slow pulls from their beer bottles, trying to shrink into the darkness. Victor waited. His gaze was blank, scanning the room not with malice, but with the cold, dead-eyed appraisal of a slaughterhouse worker counting cattle. Oliver rubbed his bad knee. He wanted to go home. He wanted a hot shower to wash off the smell of ozone and copper, but he stayed rooted to the pillar. A morbid, ugly curiosity kept him pinned there. He knew what was coming next. The gimmick. The hook that Cole used to pack this rotting basement with fools willing to empty their savings accounts. Cole walked over to a scarred metal folding table near the edge of the chalk square. He hoisted a heavy olive green canvas duffel bag onto it. The zipper screamed as he yanked it open. With a dramatic heave, Cole dumped the contents onto the table. Stacks of bills, hundreds, 50s, bound tightly with thick rubber bands. They tumbled over each other, a green mountain of impossible promises, $500,000 in cold, untraceable cash. The collective intake of breath from the crowd sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. Oliver felt his stomach twist. He knew exactly what that much money smelled like: dirt and desperation. $500,000, Cole shouted, slapping the table. The metal rattled. $500,000 right here, to any man in this room who can step into that square and last 5 seconds. Cole raised his hand, spreading 5 fingers wide. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You don't have to win. You don't even have to throw a punch. You just have to stay on your feet and conscious for 5 seconds against the Russian. Silence hung thick and suffocating. 5 seconds. It sounded so brief. You could hold your breath for 5 seconds. You could close your eyes and count to 5 before the traffic light changed. But in that chalk square, staring down an apex predator who hit like a falling safe, 5 seconds was an eternity. It was enough time to die twice. A man stepped out of the crowd. Oliver recognized him vaguely. A dock worker from the harbor. Big shoulders, thick neck, eyes hollowed out by debt and bad choices. The man's hands were shaking as he pulled off his denim jacket, revealing a faded tattoo on a pale, hairy bicep. He stared at the money on the table, his lips moving silently. He was doing the math. $500,000 meant a new life. It meant outrunning whatever ghosts were chasing him. "I'll do it," the man mumbled, stepping into the light. Cole grinned, revealing a row of nicotine-stained teeth. "Step right in, friend. Just 5 seconds." The dock worker walked into the chalk square. He raised his fists, adopting a stiff, awkward boxing stance. His breathing was ragged, loud in the quiet room. He looked at Victor. Victor looked back. "Time starts when he swings," Cole said, stepping back into the shadows, checking his gold wristwatch. "Go." The dock worker didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, throwing a heavy, looping right hook aimed at Victor's ribs, hoping to smother the giant, to tie him up in a clinch and ride out the clock. 1 second. Victor didn't retreat. He simply stepped inside the arc of the punch. He dropped his shoulder, transferring his immense weight, and delivered a short, brutal palm strike straight to the center of the dock worker's chest. 2 seconds. The sound was sickening, a deep, hollow crack like a tree branch giving way under heavy snow. The dock worker left his feet entirely. He flew backward, crashing hard onto the concrete outside the chalk lines. He bounced once, then lay motionless, his chest heaving irregularly as his body tried to remember how to breathe. 3 seconds. Victor lowered his hand. He looked bored. "Get him out," Cole sighed, not even bothering to look at the fallen man. The 2 handlers dragged the dock worker away. "Anyone else? Or is everyone in the city a coward?" Oliver shook his head. The cruelty of it made him nauseous. It wasn't a fight. It was a meat grinder. The money was bait, and these men were just feeding the machine. He reached into his coat pocket for a cigarette, his fingers trembling slightly. He struck a match, the sudden flare of sulfur burning his nostrils. That was when the heavy steel door at the top of the concrete stairwell scraped open. The sound was jarring, a sharp metallic squeal that cut through the low murmur of the room. Heads turned. Even Victor shifted his gaze slightly toward the stairs. Footsteps echoed down the concrete steps. Click, clack, click, clack. Hard leather soles on stone, not the heavy muffled tread of combat boots or the squeak of boxing shoes. It was a leisurely, rhythmic sound. A man emerged from the shadows of the stairwell and walked into the dim light of the warehouse. Oliver paused. the match burning precariously close to his fingers. The newcomer was utterly incongruous with the setting. He was of Asian descent, small in stature, maybe 5'7", weighing no more than 140 pounds. He was dressed in a sharp, immaculately tailored dark suit with a silk shirt underneath, unbuttoned slightly at the collar. He wore dark leather loafers that gleamed despite the dust on the floor. He didn't look like a fighter. He looked like an actor who had wandered onto the wrong set, or a high-end gambler looking for a private card game. But it was his face that caught Oliver off guard. The man was smiling. It wasn't the manic, adrenaline-fueled grin of a psychopath, nor was it the arrogant smirk of a fool. It was a soft, genuine smile. The kind of smile you wear when you see an old friend across a crowded room, or when you notice a particularly interesting puzzle. He walked toward the center of the room, his hands resting easily in his trouser pockets, his gait loose and entirely devoid of tension. The crowd parted for him instinctively, confused by his complete lack of fear. Predators recognize prey by the way it moves, by the scent of its terror. This man walked through a room of wolves and smelled only of expensive cologne and absolute calm. Oliver finally dropped the match as it scorched his thumb, cursing under his breath. "What is this kid doing?" he thought, his chest tightening. "He's going to get his head torn off." The small man stopped at the edge of the chalk square. He looked at the mountain of cash on the table, tilting his head slightly as if evaluating the currency's authenticity. Then, he turned his gaze to Victor. For the first time all night, Victor's expression changed. His flat, dead eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. The Russian giant looked down at the newcomer, a full 1.5 feet taller, outweighing him by at least 150 pounds. Victor shifted his weight slightly, a microscopic adjustment, but Oliver saw it. The machine recognized something in the room that didn't compute. Cole stepped forward, looking the stranger up and down with obvious disdain. "You lost, pal. The VIP lounge is uptown." The man turned to Cole. His smile widened slightly, warming his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was smooth, carrying a calm, rhythmic cadence that commanded the quiet room. "I heard there was a wager," Bruce said gently. He gestured toward the table with a slight nod of his head. $500,000, 5 seconds. "Yeah," Cole sneered, crossing his arms. "That's the bet. You want a piece? I'll warn you, the hospital bills will cost more than your suit." Bruce chuckled, a dry, breathy sound. He pulled his hands from his pockets and slowly unbuttoned his suit jacket, folding it neatly over his arm. Underneath, his body was hidden by the loose fit of the silk shirt, offering no hint of the physical architecture beneath. He moved with a relaxed grace that felt almost lazy. 5 seconds, Bruce repeated, stepping over the thick white chalk line into the square. He looked up at Victor, his eyes bright, analytical, tracing the massive lines of the Russian's shoulders and jaw. The smile never left his face. "Seems a bit long, don't you think?" Oliver felt a chill wash over him, raising the hairs on his arms. The room suddenly felt suffocatingly small. The cynic in him screamed that this arrogant kid was about to be broken into pieces. But another, deeper instinct, an instinct honed by decades of watching men fight, bleed, and die, told him something else. Oliver watched the way Bruce's feet settled against the cracked concrete. He watched the way the small man breathed, drawing the air deep into his abdomen, grounding himself to the earth. He wasn't suicidal, he was relaxed, and in a room built on fear, standing in front of a giant who dealt in shattered bones. That relaxation was the most terrifying thing Oliver had ever seen. Cole clicked the heavy silver stopwatch in his palm. The metallic snap echoed off the concrete pillars like a gunshot. Go. Time did not slow down. That was a myth Oliver had heard from men who had never actually been in the ring. When violence of this magnitude erupts, time accelerates. It compresses, forcing the human brain to process a chaotic blur of physics and malice in fractions of a heartbeat. 1 second. Victor did not swing. He lunged. The sheer mass of the Russian displacing the heavy stagnant air created a localized breeze that fluttered the collar of Oliver's coat. Victor closed the distance with horrifying speed, leading with a left hook that wasn't designed to knock a man out. It was designed to tear his jaw from its hinges. The fist, wrapped in stained athletic tape, sailed toward the side of Bruce's head. Bruce didn't duck. He didn't scramble backward. He performed a micro-adjustment. He tilted his neck a fraction of an inch to the right, simultaneously pivoting his left heel. The heavy fist grazed Bruce's shoulder. The sound of coarse tape violently dragging across fine silk ripped through the silence. A sharp, expensive, tearing noise. The sheer kinetic force of the near miss whipped Bruce's hair across his forehead. He wasn't untouched. The sheer friction left a red, angry welt along his collarbone. The smile was gone. His face hardened into a mask of pure, predatory geometry. 2 seconds. Victor's momentum from the missed hook carried him forward, but he was a trained killer, not a street brawler. He utilized the over-rotation, violently spinning his massive frame to deliver a devastating spinning back fist with his right arm. It was a localized hurricane of bone and muscle. Bruce stepped into it. Oliver gasped, the sound catching painfully in his dry throat. Stepping into a strike like that was suicidal. It defied every instinct of self-preservation. But Bruce dropped his center of gravity, his tailored loafers squeaking sharply against the grit of the concrete floor. He raised his left forearm, not to block the blow. Blocking it would have snapped his radius like a dry twig, but to parry, redirecting the colossal energy of the Russian's arm over his own head. The heat of Victor's sweating arm radiated against Bruce's face. The smell was overpowering, stale garlic, raw ammonia, and the dark, heavy scent of unwashed violence. Bruce's legs trembled for a microsecond under the displaced weight of the giant. He was human. The effort of shifting 300 pounds of moving muscle required a terrifying exertion of core strength. A sharp breath hissed through Bruce's teeth, a sound of profound exertion. 3 seconds. Victor was horribly overextended, his chest wide open. The giant realized his error instantly, his flat, pale eyes widening in a sudden flash of primitive panic. He tried to pull back, to establish distance, to use his massive reach to smother the smaller man. He was entirely too late. Bruce didn't wind up. He didn't pull his arm back to generate momentum. He was already inside the killing box. He planted his right foot flat on the cracked cement, drawing power not from his shoulder, but from the earth itself. The energy coiled through his calf, up his thigh, violently torquing his hips. He delivered a short, brutal strike to the side of Victor's left knee. It wasn't a high, flashy kick. It was a vicious, unglamorous, oblique kick, the kind of strike taught in military trenches, designed purely to break the structural foundation of the human body. 4 seconds. The sound was nauseating. It wasn't a clean snap. It was a wet, tearing crunch, like thick canvas being ripped apart, accompanied by the hollow pop of a patella forcefully dislocating. Victor didn't scream. He simply stopped functioning. The laws of gravity, which he had dominated his entire life, suddenly turned against him. With his left knee pulverized, the left side of his massive body collapsed. 300 pounds of dense muscle dragged him violently downward, tilting his upper body forward into the empty space Bruce had deliberately created. 5 seconds. Victor was falling. His jaw was slack with shock, his massive chest plunging downward toward Bruce's waist level. Bruce adjusted his stance, his feet moving with the crisp precision of a dancer. He chambered his right fist, perfectly aligned with the dead center of Victor's descending chest. The distance between Bruce's knuckles and Victor's sternum was less than 3 inches. Bruce exhaled sharply, a harsh, guttural sound from deep within his diaphragm. His hips snapped forward. The 1-inch punch connected with the solar plexus. The impact did not sound like a punch. It lacked the theatrical, meaty smack of a closed fist hitting a jawbone or the wet, hollow thud of leather sinking into a rib cage. Instead, it sounded like a heavy wooden baseball bat striking a side of wet beef swinging in a meat locker. Thwack. There was no follow-through. Bruce's fist did not drive through the target. It stopped dead, exactly 1 inch past the surface of Victor's skin. The kinetic energy had nowhere to go but inside. It transferred entirely into the Russian's body, a localized seismic event detonating directly over the celiac plexus, a dense cluster of nerves radiating outward from the pit of the stomach like the roots of a dying tree. The immediate physiological response was catastrophic. Victor's downward momentum was arrested instantly, violently countered by the upward and inward trajectory of Bruce's fist. A visible shock wave, a horrifying ripple of displaced tissue and muscle, snapped through the sweat-soaked fabric of Victor's gray undershirt. For a fraction of a second, the giant hung suspended in the dim, smoky air. He was entirely disconnected from the earth, hovering purely on the devastating force of the blow. Then, the air violently evacuated his lungs. It wasn't a gasp. It was a wet, involuntary bark that sprayed fine droplets of saliva and mucus across the white chalk line. The vagus nerve, violently compressed, sent an emergency override signal directly to Victor's brainstem. His heart rate plummeted. His blood pressure dropped into the abyss. His legs, already compromised by the shattered knee, completely lost their structural integrity. Victor hit the concrete like a demolished building. The impact shook the floorboard so violently that Oliver felt the vibration travel up through his bad knee and rattle his jaw. A thick cloud of gray dust plumed upward from the deep cracks in the cement, swirling lazily into the cones of buzzing halogen light. Victor lay flat on his back. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the rusted pipes crisscrossing the low ceiling. He was completely conscious, but entirely trapped inside a malfunctioning machine. His chest heaved in shallow, frantic, terrifying spasms. His diaphragm, paralyzed by the blunt force trauma to the nerve cluster, desperately tried to remember how to pull oxygen into his body, resulting in a horrible, wet, sucking sound. His left leg was bent beneath him at a grotesque, unnatural angle. He was alive, but the apex predator had been meticulously, surgically dismantled. It had taken exactly 5 seconds. The silence in the warehouse was no longer just the absence of noise. It was a physical weight. It pressed down on the room, heavy and suffocating. It was broken only by the erratic, rasping gasps of the fallen giant, the hum of the lighting fixtures, and the distant, rhythmic rumble of the subway vibrating through the bedrock. No one moved. The loan sharks with their bruised knuckles, the junkies with their hollow cheeks, the degenerate gamblers clutching their useless betting slips. They were rendered entirely motionless. Their brains were locked in a cognitive loop, utterly incapable of processing the data their retinas had just recorded. Monsters did not fall to men who wore tailored silk. Oliver slowly lowered his hand. His cigarette had burned down to the orange filter, scorching his index finger, but he didn't feel the blister forming on his skin. He couldn't drag his eyes away from the center of the chalk square. Bruce stood over the fallen Russian. He did not raise his arms in victory. He did not pound his chest or scream into the shadows or look to the crowd for validation. He looked exhausted. His breathing was heavy, ragged, and undeniably human. The flawless, serene composure he had worn when walking down the concrete stairs was gone, burned away by the raw, unvarnished reality of violent physical exertion. A thick sheen of sweat coated his forehead, catching the pale, sickly light of the basement. He looked down at his right hand. The knuckles were already swelling, a deep, angry purple blossoming under the skin. He reached up with his left hand, his fingers trembling slightly, a microscopic tremor born of a massive adrenaline dump. He touched the torn silk at his shoulder. His fingertips traced the red, raised welt where Victor's massive fist had grazed him. Bruce winced. It was a sharp, involuntary tightening of his jaw. That wince was the most terrifying thing Oliver had seen all night. It proved the man wasn't a god. He wasn't magic. He was flesh and bone. He had just operated on the absolute razor-thin margin between life and death. If his pivot had been a fraction of an inch slower, if his weight transfer had been slightly off balance, Victor's spinning back fist would have removed his head from his shoulders. Bruce knew it. He hadn't performed a miracle. He had simply executed perfect, ruthless, unforgiving physics, and it had demanded a profound physical toll. Bruce closed his eyes. He took a slow, deep breath, pulling the foul, metallic air deep into his lungs, consciously forcing his heart rate to slow. When he opened his eyes, the cold, analytical calmness had returned. The mask was back in place. He turned his back on the gasping giant and walked toward the scarred metal table. Cole was standing behind it, frozen in a state of absolute, petrified shock. His jaw hung open, a slick layer of terrified sweat shining on his receding hairline. He looked from the broken behemoth on the floor to the small, dark-haired man approaching him. Cole's eyes darted frantically toward the shadowed corners of the warehouse, as if hoping his armed bouncers would step in. But the bouncers were rooted to the floor, staring at Bruce with the same reverent terror as everyone else. Bruce stopped at the edge of the table. He looked down at the mountain of green bills, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Cole's. The polite, gentle smile slowly returned to Bruce's face, though it didn't quite reach the cold, dark depths of his eyes. "I believe," Bruce said. His voice was smooth, breathy, and incredibly quiet. It carried effortlessly through the dead, silent room. That was exactly 5 seconds. Cole swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed sharply against his tight, sweat-stained collar. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords refused to engage. He simply nodded, a jerky, pathetic, mechanical motion. Bruce reached out and casually picked up the heavy olive-green canvas duffel bag. He didn't rush. The tension in the room stretched until it felt like piano wire snapping. Bruce meticulously began sweeping the stacks of rubber-banded hundreds into the canvas opening. His movements were precise and deliberate. Thwip, thwip, thwip. The soft, heavy sound of the cash hitting the bottom of the bag echoed loudly. It took time to pack 5,000 separate bills. For 2 full minutes, the only sounds were Victor's wet breathing and the rustle of dirty money-changing hands. When the metal table was bare, exposing its deep scratches and rust stains, Bruce zipped the bag shut. The metal zipper rasped like a saw blade. He slung the heavy canvas strap over his uninjured left shoulder. $500,000 weighed over 10 pounds, and the sheer bulk of it made Bruce list slightly to the side. It was a final grounding detail that reminded Oliver this was just a man carrying a heavy load. Bruce turned toward the stairwell. The crowd didn't just part for him, they practically shrank into the damp concrete walls. Men sucked in their stomachs and pulled their shoulders back, desperate to avoid catching his eye, terrified that even accidental eye contact might trigger the violence they had just witnessed. Oliver remained pinned to his structural pillar. As Bruce walked by, he was close enough that Oliver could smell him. The sharp, clean, expensive scent of his cologne cut right through the underlying stench of blood, cheap beer, and raw ozone. Bruce paused. He stopped right in front of Oliver. He looked at the old, weathered-cut man. He looked at the blistered burn on Oliver's fingers where the cigarette had died, then slowly raised his gaze to meet Oliver's pale eyes. For a fleeting second, the impenetrable wall of perfect discipline dropped. Bruce didn't smile. He gave Oliver a barely perceptible nod. It wasn't a boast. It was a silent, heavy acknowledgement from one man who understood the brutal, ugly mechanics of the dark world to another man who had spent his life submerged in it. Oliver nodded back, his throat entirely dry. Bruce turned away. Click, clack, click, clack. The hard leather soles struck the concrete stairs, the rhythm steady and unhurried. The sound faded slowly, rising up into the darkness, eventually swallowed entirely by the rumble of the city above. He left behind a broken giant drowning in his own chest, an empty metal table, and a basement full of men who would spend the rest of their lives trying to convince themselves they hadn't seen a ghost. Did this raw underground encounter get your blood pumping? The legend of Bruce Lee isn't just in the polished movies. It's found in the unseen moments of pure, brutal, structural mastery. If you crave more gritty, deeply human stories of martial arts history and underground legends, don't let this be the last video you watch. Hit that like button, share this story with a fellow fight fan, and subscribe to the channel right now. Turn on notifications so you never miss a fight.